Hello, greetings, everybody. Welcome to Biosophy Online. It's been a few weeks, a couple of bumps and bruises and twists and turns, but we are back. I see knowledge is the new power on the line, and I'm welcoming Dr. Ali and others who are joining in. We have, in my opinion, a wonderful show today, a show of depth and a show that you just can't find um, when it comes down to talking about these particular things. We're going to be discussing the Cherokee tradition, particularly in this segment, in lieu of the whole topic of Native American wisdom and Native First Nations dealing and healing practices when associated with trauma and traumatic episodes and uh, emotional trauma to the brain. Believe it or not, the First Nations people had plenty of experience with that and different methods and strategies that they would use when dealing with it. And so I myself do not carry that cultural heritage. I'm not claiming to carry it, but being in North Carolina right now and having studied the Cherokee a lot and looking in the last few months into whatever I could find and going out, I spent a good deal of time on Cherokee lands and the Cherokee reservation here, and also have participated in quite a few sweat lodges. I'll be sharing what I can, sharing what I know. Ideally, I'd like to have a guest on, somebody that has more depth in the cultural knowledge. But I think what I have to pass on today will be justified, and it'll be definitely enough to fill one's palate. So, without further ado, I'd like to get into beginning this session with a story and a very kind of, a practice, the story of a practice that the Cherokee held and still hold sacred for generations, for millennia. And of course, the Cherokee people, just to start with, we're made up of 8 different states and 10 to 12 different major clans, of course. And we're looking at the southern Appalachian region and the region of North Carolina, western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia. And the Cherokee have this fascinating history that is very unlike other tribes in the U.S. There's so many different theories about where they came from and the nature of how they looked and their appearance and their practices. They were just very unique when it comes down to it, which begs a lot of historical questions as well as to their origins. There is traces of African influence in their culture, traces of European and even Atlantean influences, and of course very indigenous steep traditions that are very similar to those tribes of the West, and theoretically coming over the Bering Strait from the Orient. So they have this amazing amalgamation of cultural influence that really is amazing, to study and to kind of dive into. They themselves, of course, know their history better than anybody. And there is a lot of story and myth. We call it myth, they call it story, of course, because their stories were not made up. Their stories were versions of truth that happened a long time ago, whether it was the creation of thunder and lightning or whether it was the creation of the clans. In their mythology or in their stories, they do speak of peoples that lived on Turtle Island, which is the U.S., the U.S. mainland. And those peoples had various skin colors and various traits that were there was a white or lighter skinned people that lived in the north. There was a darker skinned people that lived in the south, the southeast, and then so on and so forth. So it's interesting that the Cherokee um, tradition passes on that at one time in the United States there were people of different races here, or at least in theory. Getting past all of that, let's move into the rites of passage story here. I think this is very significant because how one raises their children and how one culture introduces their socializing process, or introduces their worldview to their child, is something that is monumental. And I think we think of that every day when we see children growing up around us. What do they see as true? What can they trust? How are they building their perspective of reality around them? Who's influencing them? Well, the Cherokee, and I'm talking about the boys, the young men. The women, of course, had their own rites of passage as well. But this particular one for boys, I always found fascinating and heartwarming. The boys would first go on a fast. They would do a 2 or 3 day water fast or liquid fast, from my understanding. And they were about adolescent age, whenever the father thought it was the right time, whenever it was the right season. But the boy was usually anywhere from 11 to 13. Some boys developed later and some earlier, of course. But when the father thought it was the right time, he would tell the son to begin his fast, that it was time for him to become a man. And everybody knew about that this would happen, of course. None of the men would tell the boys what exactly it was, but there was a firm line, of course, that separated men from boys, and boys knew that they weren't yet men, and men knew that they weren't boys anymore because of this distinguished event that took place. And the event took place by the 2 or 3 day fast. And after the fasting period, when the father thought it was the right time, he would take the young man out to the woods, out into the mountains here, probably the same mountains over my shoulder here to the left. And he would take him to a certain place and have him sit, usually on a flat surface, and they would lay out a sacred blanket. And the boy didn't really know what to expect. He just knew that this was something that he had to do. He knew that it was just, that all of it was true, and all of it was something he had to follow and something he had to respect. To be a man, he had to follow through. And so the father said, I'm going to blindfold you. I'm going to put this cloth around your head, around your eyes, and what you have to do is stay here on this blanket overnight for your 3rd night and continue your fast. Now, of course, by this time the boy was hungry already and in a state of heightened awareness. And it was designed, of course, for fear to set in. That's one of the things that I think our modern day society wouldn't understand, is that the design was for the boy to be afraid, but to find that place beyond fear, so that this would take him to manhood. So the blindfold would go on the boy, and the boy would be sitting there alone on his blanket, not being able to see. And then, of course, night would fall, and the boy would become very afraid, very frightened at certain points. There's many sounds out in the forest, of course, as some of you might know from camping and spending time out there. At one point in my life, when I was camping, I heard a sound. I think it was a bird. I would have to say it was some sort of bird, but it sounded like a pterodactyl. And I was in the Appalachian Mountains. It was no normal bird. And I tell you what, you wonder what comes out at night. You really do, because it's not what you imagine. So anyway, the boy had to withstand this. And mind you, when my nights in the forest were in a tent, this young man and others who have done their vision quest would be sitting on the blanket by themselves in total faith. And they knew they couldn't take the blindfold off. Finally, after a long night, often cold, shivering, frightened beyond belief, the father would come and ask the boy to remove his blindfold. And the boy would take it off when the sun was about to rise. And he would at first not be able to see very well. And, the light was kind of blinding, probably had tears dried up in his eyes. But he looked across from him and he saw that his father had camped out about 15, 20 feet away from him. and had spent the night on his blanket, making sure that the boy was protected and the boy was okay. And the young man had no idea that the father was there. And the father will tell the boy the next morning that this lesson is for you to realize that whenever you believe you're alone, and whenever you believe that nothing is protecting you and nothing's watching over you, always remember that there is a great power that is protecting you and watching over you, and that you can choose fear, or you can choose what's more important than fear, right? Which is courage. And so that bond was made with the father right there, so that the boy not only trusts the father and knows that the father would protect him and not leave him ever, but he would also know that creation and that the ancestral spirits, or whatever deified forces, if you will, were watching over him as well. And so it was a test of faith. It was a test of strength and courage. It was also a plunge into the world of fear and darkness. And when the boy came back into the village, he then was able to get his hunting stripes and his hunting arrows and become a young warrior, right? Because he had gone through the rite of passage. And so I wanted to tell that story because I think that we can all agree we kind of lack that ceremonial rite of passage in our own society, in our own cultures today in America, or what we view as our culture here. And there is not that line between manhood and childhood, right, as much anymore. Those are blurred lines, and I think that that's one of the major issues that a lot of young men deal with, and I think that's one of the major reasons why we can't get past trauma, why boys cannot get past some of the early childhood trauma that they've been exposed to, because there's not that moment of clarity where they realize that they've entered manhood. And so psychologically, they're carrying a lot with them. And I think that we see a lot of older men who are still stuck, right, with that same paradigm and that need to acknowledge whether or not they made it, whether they proved themselves, whether they had this distinction at some point in their younger years. So in working with a lot of young men who are traumatized, and a lot of young men who are struggling with emotional management and awareness, I feel that the story is important. And I tell them this story once in a while, and it really resonates with them. In fact, there's a video on YouTube that has a segment of it as well. If you want to type in Cherokee rites of passage, it'll give you some more details on it. But the boys really resonate with this story. They thirst for things like this, and they know that they need it. You know, I possibly needed it as well. I probably put myself through my own rites of passage just intuitively, you know, at some point, maybe in my early 20s. But moving on, focusing on the Cherokee and their ceremonies and rites and rituals and practices and their norms that were practiced here for thousands of years. We're going to focus on the sweat lodge today, and the meaning and the importance and the experience of the sweat lodge. I'm going to share with you my experience, and I think that you'll find it rewarding, and I wanted to first reach out to anybody if anyone has had any experience with the sweat lodge, or if you had maybe any plans of doing it at any point in your life, or if maybe you would or you wouldn't after hearing all this. But does anyone have anything out there to start, or any particular questions we want to focus on? Okay, let's get started. You know, in this region of the country, there's a particular set of plants and animals that were considered sacred. When we get down to the true First Nations principles and beliefs, and you can find this whether we're talking about the Yaqui or the Comanche or the Ohio tribes in the Southeast, any of them and all of them viewed everything as alive and sacred. Even the rock, the stone, was alive and sacred. And the plants very much were personalities and beings. In fact, one of the clans, quite a few of the clans of the Cherokee were named after plants. There was the Wild Potato Clan, for example. And, we would probably laugh if we called ourselves the Wild Potato Clan today, but when the wild potato was used for healing and for ceremonial purposes, it had a lot of power, a lot of healing potential, and it fed that clan as well. And they cultivated that plant with a sacred honor. And so the clans, really, to understand the names of the clans is really to capture the essence of the Cherokee. And I'll just read them for now so that you get a feel for them. There was the Paint Clan, which is the clan of color. There was the Bird Clan, and they believed they were messengers between the spirit world and the earth. There was the Deer Clan, and they were usually hunters, and they were messengers amongst the Cherokee. The Wolf Clan was the largest clan, and there was the Blue Clan, which was also considered a wildcat clan. And there were wildcats, and there still are wildcats in this region here today. And then there was the Longhair Clan. The Longhair Clan was the peacemaker. They were the Peacemakers Clan, and often the Longhair Clan produced a lot of medicine men and chiefs that would facilitate peaceful talks, etc. The Sweat Lodge itself was a symbol, first and foremost, of purification. And it was a time when the healing took place. It was a time when rebirth took place. It took place just after wintertime, usually around early March, when it was still a little cold, but warm enough to where one could take their clothes off and partake in the ceremony. And so what would happen is there are a couple of different venue-style buildings and creations of the lodge, but most of them were made first with the willow bark, the willow tree, which was a small, very pliable tree that we find near damp or moist areas of the soil, near stream banks or river banks. And they would take the willow bark, willow tree, and cut it, and they would lay it in the pool. They would lay it in a pool of water so that it would get to be very pliable. And then they would dig 16 little holes in the ground, and all of this was very scientific. It was the numbers were done according to numerology. The direction of the opening of the lodge faced east, where the power came from and where knowledge and power came from, the sunrise, if you will, from the east. So the opening of the lodge was at the east. And they would put these 16 willow branches, trees in the ground, and then they would bend them over the top to form a vessel type of structure, a wigwam, if you will. You might remember the images of the wigwam. And then they would cover that with animal hides, usually bear hides, and until it was covered, until it was dark. And during the day of the lodge, they would light a fire and have an ongoing fire and sit in council. And in that fire, they would burn a great deal number of stones. So they would take stones from the riverbank and burn them and heat them for hours on end while they were building the lodge. And so the stones would be, by the time the ceremony began, the stones would be very hot. They would be almost glowing with heat. And so early on, when the ceremony begins, there's of course a long line of prayers, and there's a tobacco offering. And the tobacco offering occurs with the 4 directions. And this was very common in all of especially the eastern tribes, the Iroquois, etc. did this very same practice where they would offer tobacco to the 4 directions and offer tobacco to the ancestors in the 4 directions. And so they would face first east, and they would say, ancestors of the east, bring us your blessings and allow us to partake in this ceremony. We offer up tobacco for you, etc., etc. And then they would face the south, and then they would offer tobacco to the south and do their prayer and bend down, kiss the ground, etc. Then they would offer to the west. Each one of those 4 directions was also represented by an animal or a totem that came from that direction or that symbolized that direction. And so in the sweat lodge itself, what happens is that you have 4 rounds, and each of the 4 rounds are dedicated to the 4 directions / 4 animals that they represent. And so the rounds are different. They have different sort of energetic purposes, and I can tell you that the reality of them, even though you're in the same place, the reality changes once you shift from the wolf round, the second round, to the 3rd round. It's definitely a shift that occurs. And I'll just interject this, that my first sweat lodge that I completed, my first sweat lodge, I had to leave. I had to crawl out of there like a baby. But the second one was the most profound experience, spiritual experience I had ever had. And it confirmed for me the belief in the spirit world and the knowledge of the spirit world. You get past the point of belief to where you realize that there's something that's far greater out there. So when the sweat lodge begins, you have the womb of the earth. This is really what the symbol is that the vessel or the wigwam that's created, the structure, is shaped like a pregnant woman. It's a belly. And so the idea is when you crawl into the belly, you're going back into the womb to be fed, to be reborn, to be in darkness again, right? So it's a kind of that checking moment of really humbling yourself and reconnecting with Mother Earth. And so those who participate line up outside of the lodge when the time comes, and before they enter the lodge, they get down on their knees and they crawl in. You can't walk into the lodge. Some of these New Age lodges that I've seen, especially out west, where people are walking in the sweat lodge and talking and all this stuff. The true sweat lodge was a very sacred time and something that was done in silence for the most part, unless there was singing. So one would crawl into the lodge with the bare necessities of clothes on, and a lot of times they were naked. If they had co-ed lodges, then the clothing would be on. And you would filter through the lodge in a circle and crawl on the dirt around the pit, which was in the middle of the lodge. And those who would crawl in would filter in, and you would filter all the way around in the circle. Keep in mind that the lodge is for the most part dark, with the sash or the opening just to bring in a little sunlight when people would fill up and fill in those slots. Now, when the slots were filled, and when all of the people are sitting around in the circle, that's when the door closes, or the hide, of course, is secured. And that is complete darkness inside of the lodge. There is no light whatsoever, not even a flicker of anything. You can't see your hand in front of your face until the first stone is brought in. So those stones that were cooking that I mentioned earlier, they're brought into the pit, which is dug out in the middle of the lodge. And so that first stone is brought in, and the chanting begins. Round 1 begins. Round 1 is the round of the snake, as far as the Cherokee tradition goes. And you begin round 1 as a snake, and ultimately the purpose is not just to acknowledge the snake and say this is the snake round, but the whole idea is to become the snake. All right? And so the first round, being the snake round, it is a round of fear, because ultimately you're gaining you're not able to see, you're having a little bit of a challenge in getting your breath, and the heat is starting to build up, right? So the second and third stone are brought in, and usually a couple of stones are then steaming and burning, if you will, still from the fire. So the lodge begins to get very hot, even in that first round. In fact, the first round is probably one of the most shocking, because it brings you that heat and that darkness, and we know that the snake is one to respond to fear, right? The snake is very in a fight or flight mode all the time. So there's a certain alignment there that makes sense. During that first round, there are no songs sung. It's completely silent. I, like I said, at one point crawled out. The first thing that one does is we go around in a circle, and you state your name, you state who you are. And in my particular case, a couple of times they did a check-in, how are you feeling right now? And what are your goals? What would you like to do in this lodge? What would you like to find? Who would you like to reach, etc.? So you go around in a circle and speak some truth of some sort in that first round. The second round, when the second round stones are brought in, you begin the round of the wolf. And the wolf takes off from the home. That's the symbol of the wolf for the second round. It's the symbol of the South. And we know that the lone wolf is one to embark on the journey. And so the journey begins in that second round, where you have to begin to regulate your breathing. The first round was one of those shocking things where, how do I breathe? How am I going to get through this? It's too hot. Now the second round, you've gotten into wolf mode, and you gain the consciousness of the wolf. You actually feel that, mainly because of the songs they begin to sing. And I had the experience of a wolf that was actually behind me in my lower back when I was in the lodge one of the times. And it's just it's odd to put into words. But so this wolf energy comes into the lodge based on the chants. If I get a chance, I'll sing you one of the chants that I remember from the eagle round. But the wolf had its own songs. And so this round is challenging. You move forward. Each of the rounds are about a half hour, 40 minutes, roughly, if I had to time them. Although at a certain point you lose track of time, especially getting into the later rounds. But the second round, you move forward with the wolf energy. Songs are sung. The third round is a major important round. It is the round of the bear. It's the longest of the three. The bear was sacred to the Cherokee. The bear was medicine. It was like the bison or the buffalo was to the Lakota people. I've seen there's still plenty of bears around here, and there's some real big black bears out here that I have some footage of. They've come pretty close to me at a certain point. So the bear is something that is it's revered in Cherokee culture, and they used every part of the bear when they would kill one and eat one, of course. Anyway, the bear energy comes in on the third round, and there's one song that's sung to bring in that energy at the beginning of the third round, and the rest of the time it's quiet. The instruments that are used in the bear round are instruments that are made from bears themselves. The bones, the teeth, the shakers, everything is made from the actual bear itself in that round. And so that song is sung, and then there's silence for about 40 minutes or an hour. It's the longest round, and I would say the most challenging because of the silence. The music actually, in my opinion and in my experience, revitalizes you and gets you to kind of distract yourself from the heat. And so everybody, what the sweat lodge does, and what you realize at this point by the third round, is it forces you to go within. And think about a time in your life where you had no choice but to cut out your senses, your sense of vision, your hearing, your touch, everything, and just go within. It's a very special moment, right? A lot of us maybe even have not had that a moment like that. I'm sure some of us have. But that bear round really makes you do that. And it's symbolic because that's exactly what the bear does, right? In the wintertime, it goes into the cave. It goes into the darkness. The bear and the bear round represent fear, okay? While the wolf round represented hope and the snake round represented infancy, the bear represented fear, because it's the fear that has to take place first before the transformation occurs, right? No transformation occurs in comfort. And so the bear round is this long round where at one point, I and others, you would go down to the soil. It's so hot at one point that you put your face in the dirt just to feel some coolness and to cool off a little bit. And the temperature is a drastic difference when you go down to the dirt. It's about 10 or 15 degrees cooler. So you end up laying your face on that dirt to get a little air, and then you come back up and you kind of work through that. The first time I did it, I couldn't manage. Like I said, I crawled out. I asked for permission and I crawled out. But after that, I was able to kind of work my way through it. So the bear round finally ends, and you have the final round, which is the round of rebirth, and that is the round of the eagle. And so the eagle is this sort of last explosion. It's a kind of opening of song and prayer and offering and gratitude and crying. You'll hear people crying and wailing, and it's a time of happiness. There's this tremendous amount of happiness, and the instruments begin. The feather is introduced, and so the feather is fanning everybody. There's this tremendous energy that occurs in the sweat lodge at this point. The sweat lodge name in Cherokee is Inipi, which kind of rhymes with teepee, if you want to remember. But the time in the Inipi, when the fourth round occurs, is something very special, very special. And the eagle energy comes in. The eagle brings the fire of rebirth, and you are hot, you are overheated, but there's something that is allowing you to just not really even think about it and to not internalize it. You can really understand that at this point it is all mind and spirit over matter, and it actually occurs by whatever miracle it really does happen. So this is probably, when you're getting to the end of the eagle round, you're looking at an hour and a half, 2 hours of being in the lodge, which is, a long time. But it's quite an experience. And at the end, the final prayers are said, and everybody exits one at a time, and you crawl. And when you crawl out, usually there's a stream nearby, and you just lay in the stream, and your body cools, and you're to lay on your back. And what you do is you look up at the sun. You look up at the clouds and the sky and the sun. And then you are reborn. And so this purification ceremony was done on a regular basis for a lot of people who were injured during the year, or a lot of widows who had lost their husband, or vice versa, people who had dealt with death. It was done for hunters who experienced something very difficult during a hunt, or who were injured. And it was for, other people as well. But from my understanding, it was a healing purification ceremony that allowed you to start over. And so I've been very blessed and fascinated, at the same time, to partake in some of these. And the gentleman that led me on 2 or 3 occasions, his name was Jay Nightwolf. And he was a Cherokee elder, and rest in peace, he has passed, I believe. And he was doing a radio show out of Washington, D.C. at one point during the pipeline protests, if you remember those, out in, I believe it was Oregon. when they had those protests about 5 or so years ago. And his son, I believe his name was Juan, his son, who was part Aztec Mexican, had gone to the pipeline protests, and it was actually on film. They sprayed him with the pepper spray and all that. It was a terrible thing that took place out there. It was people were freezing. They would spray them with freezing water, and they were protesting. But anyway, getting back to it, Jay Nightwolf led these lodges in Maryland at one point, and I was very able to be connected and go out and experience a couple of them. The Lakota lodges are said to be a lot more intense and very difficult than the Cherokee, but it's all about the individual and their experience. So the lodge itself representing that womb, that rebirth, going into the earth again, going into the mother so that you can be revitalized again. I'm probably due for another sweat lodge. My friend in Florida invited me to one. He does Lakota sweat lodges, and I have to admit that half of me wants to go and do it, and I know I need to, and the other half of me just wants to sit home and and eat ice cream at night, So it's all about the individual choice and at whatever point you are in your life. But you can certainly access a sweat lodge, and a very good one. If you'd like, let me know. I can direct you to Emiliano, who is of First Nations cultural heritage and blood, and he leads ceremonies in the Gainesville area in Florida. So if you're ever interested, let me know. He's a great brother. And this purification will be something that, of course, you'll remember the rest of your life, but you will feel and reap the benefits for it the rest of your life as well. It's an amazing practice that took place on this continent and still does today. The Cherokee keep up many of their traditions. I spent some time on the reservation here, and they're just wonderful people who have been through a lot, of course. One of the most beautiful things I've seen on the reservation is that they still have the flame burning from the original fire, the last fire that was lit before the Trail of Tears. And I don't know if some of you might remember the Trail of Tears. This is when Andrew Jackson forcibly removed about 3,000 Cherokee westward towards Oklahoma on foot in the wintertime. And actually there were, I think, 5,000 or 10,000, but 3,000 of them about died. And so the original campfire the night before they left, that flame is still preserved in their space, their kind of amphitheater space over there in Cherokee, North Carolina. It just gives you chills, when you see it. It's just, I could get probably emotional just talking about it, but it's very, very sacred, very sacred, very honorable. So beautiful people with beautiful traditions. Any comments or questions on the Sweat Lodge? I was going to tell you about one more healing modality that they do that I think you'll find interesting as well for trauma, but this one was definitely used. This next one I thought would be very much related to what we call earthing. The New Age hippie movement has a lot of terms for what indigenous people had done thousands of years ago, and still do. So the New Age term for earthing is walking around barefoot or being as close to nature as you can, forest bathing, right, laying in the forest, which are all very healing, very transformative and very calming of the soul, the great practices. The woods and the plants and the leaves and all have a kaleidoscope of different energies that provide us with healing of various organs. Our organs are reflected in nature, of course. The liver is the wood, and touching the wood, feeling the wood heals the liver. For example, the streams are the kidneys. Sitting by the stream and breathing, doing your meditation heals the kidneys. It heals the urinary tract, right? The sun heals the heart, etc. So this particular practice of the Cherokee was done oftentimes with broken bones, but also with heart issues, inflammation, and arthritis. And that was they would dig a hole about 6 feet, 5 or 6 feet deep into the soil, into the black soil, and they would physically bury themselves. They would go into the ground, bury themselves up to their chin, up to their neck, and they would sit in that earth, sit in the soil, not sit in it, but stand in it or whatever, for hours. And those minerals, those ions, that spiritual energy, that force, if you will, whether the mycelium, the crystals, all of it that came through the soil, healed the body very rapidly, very rapidly. And so the burying practice is something that I don't think they still do today, but that was a traditional Cherokee practice that was done where they would actually physically go into the earth and you would just lay there for hours in the ground. So, hey, if all else fails, it's just another idea for you in the toolbox. Of course, they had a tremendous assortment of herbs and plants that they used, endless in endless variations and used for endless purposes. I just learned. I go to a men's group every week, and we just learned about how they made baskets and fiber from I believe it was a type of orchid tree. I can't remember the exact name of the tree, but the fibers were used, and they showed us how to spin it with our hands and our fingers and twirl it up, and you can make some very strong rope-like fibers from that plant. But they used a lot of plants for healing, particularly for trauma. They focused on blue cohosh and black cohosh, which were very good, as well as skullcap. Of course, they would boil those teas, or they would make a poultice. Sometimes for wounds, skullcap would be used directly on the wound. And another one that I saw that they use for trauma, and that is just what they would call agitation of the mind, was the fern bush. And they would actually take the young fern, a fern that was not totally unfurled. In other words, it had to be still young and it had to be still curled. And they would cook that fern or boil it and eat it for all sorts of mental anguish, pain, trauma, emotional stress. And that was a healing plant that they used for that particular instance. And I'm saying this because we have this stuff growing around us still. It's all over. It's all over the Appalachian region. If you're in PA or Jersey or Maryland, you can find these plants. Stinging nettle was another very, very powerful plant that they used to harvest during the springtime, especially for sinuses, immunorespiratory, immune system, and drinking stinging nettle every day was a big one. So a lady slipper was another one. Anyway, I could go on. There were so many that they would use for multi purposes. I left a article in the chat of an NIH study of Cherokee plants and the effect of Cherokee herbs. And you'll see in that study that the herbs were very powerful and did in fact heal people of those various maladies. So let's remember that next time we're taking a walk in the forest. And let's remember that next time we're on Amazon. Pick up yourself a book of local herbs or Cherokee herbs, because there's great documentation. They have a lot out there of all the uses of herbs. And I'll tell you why we want to use those herbs more than any other herbs. We get chamomile from Europe. We get wild yam from Africa, or some of these herbs from South America, which is great. But the herbs that are growing under our feet on this land, on Turtle Island, have a particular potency because they're matching everything that we're breathing in. All of our experience and our interaction with the plants, the pollen, the particular odor and fragrances and minerals and all of the things we're exposed to, the microbes that are from the forests that we live near, are from where these plants grow. And so we have to see ourselves as part of this environment, as one with this environment. We're breathing in the air that the plants that we use to heal ourselves are breathing in the same air. And so that makes the plant potent. It makes it very much an ancestral being-like spirit that could provide healing in a different dimension than just a plant that was grown somewhere else and flown over here to be used. So please consider that. Consider using local herbs that grow in the forests and regions of where you're from, because they have that particular quality and character about them. Echinacea was another one. Elderberry was a big one that was used by the Cherokee. So, echinacea and elderberry, I know a lot of you are familiar with. Golden seal as well. They grew golden seal. So they were doctors. I mean, those shamans and those medicine men, when you talk about the Cherokee medicine men, and the sages, the women, of course, knew the berries. They knew the forest like the back of their hand. They knew exactly what they were doing. And I certainly would trust those traditions and have trusted them, with my own health. So that about wraps up the show, everybody. I know I was kind of rambling on there. I hope you picked up some gems. And I hope you enjoyed the segment and enjoy the knowledge as much as I do. I think that it is very pertinent, and they, in this world of madness, and we know what we're dealing with. I don't have to go through that. We still have to remember that there are things that will ground us, and there are things that are available for us, traditions, cultural traditions, places we can still go today where we can tap into our strength, we can tap into our spiritual and ancestral realms, and receive the energy, receive the fortitude, receive the healing that we need to continue our journey and to navigate these very difficult times. The ancestors and the ancient ones, they want us to reach out to them. They want us to chant the traditional songs, to play the traditional drums, to drink the traditional plants and teas, because they know that's what's going to carry us through these times. And so give thanks for listening and joining with me today. I hope to see you all in 2 weeks. I'll be back on, probably with continuing a similar theme here. We might look at a different modality, maybe different tradition. And I'll just open it up for any comments or questions before we tap off here.
Yes, I'd like to thank you, Brother Eric.
Thank you, brother.
All the information you have given us. It's very important to go back to the source. Very, very important.
Mm-hmm.
In doing so, it'll connect you to the present. And so, again, I appreciate you very much, my brother.
Indeed, brother. I appreciate you being on today. Sankofa, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all. Take care of yourselves. Be well. Go with God. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Brother Eric.
Peace, brother. Thank you.